Good morning to all attending the RTA's meeting of the Board of Directors. Let's review guidelines for our meeting this morning. For the members who are in person, first of all, thank you for being here. Please turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and off when you are finished so that we may limit speaking or conversation to one person at a time or one member at a time. I will call on those with questions or comments for those attending in person. For those of you who are remote, please keep your audio on mute as much as possible to minimize any background noise, which may impair the recording of this meeting. When you have a question, please raise your virtual hand. I think you've gotten good at that over time. And the board secretary, Mr. LaMarche, will call on board members who have raised their hands one at a time. When he calls on you, lower your hand, if you remember, please, and unmute before you are speaking. With that said, I will now officially call the meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority to order. And will everybody in person please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance
to the flag, States of America, one nation, God.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, will you please take the roll?
Yes. Director Indulcio.
Here.
Director Canty.
Here.
Director Carey.
Here.
Director Colson.
Here.
Director Fuentes.
Here.
Director Gavin. Director Gorman. Director Groven.
Here.
Director Holt.
Here.
Director Cotel.
Here.
Director Lewis.
Here.
Director Melvin. Director Pang. Director Ross.
Here.
Director Sager.
Here.
Chairman Dillard.
Present.
14 present and 2 absent, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The first item for action is item 3, and that's the approval of the minutes from the board meeting held on August 18th of 2022. Are there any comments or corrections to the minutes as they've been sent to you? If not, how about a motion and a second to approve?
So moved.
Director Fuentes moves we approve. Director Canty seconds. Jeremy, please take a roll call, if you would.
Director Indulcio.
Aye.
Director Canty.
Aye.
Director Carey.
Aye.
Director Colson. Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Gavin. Director Gorman. Director Groven.
Aye.
Director Holt. Director Cotel.
Aye.
Director Lewis.
Aye.
Director Melvin. Director Pang. Director Ross.
Yes.
Director Sager.
Yes.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes.
14 ayes.
Thank you. And the minutes from August are approved. Item 4 is the public comment segment of the meeting. Any comments now will be read into the record by the board secretary. Do we receive any, Mr. Secretary?
No, we've had no public comments submitted at this time.
And is there anybody present here that wishes to speak? Seeing no one, we'll move on to item 5, which is the executive director's report. Leanne.
Good morning, Chairman Dillard and members of the board, those of you in person and those of you joining us online. I have a fairly brief report this morning, but first I just want to touch on something you've probably heard about in the media, the potential of a railroad strike pending. But I wanted to let you know that overnight a tentative agreement was reached between the freight railroad companies and their union, averting a strike that could have started possibly as early as tonight. And would have impacted our regional rail service, specifically on a couple of the Metra lines. As of now, Metra has announced that there'll be no service interruptions and that all the trains, including those originally cancelled for this evening, will be running as originally on their regular schedules. I recommend, though, that you or anybody traveling over the next couple of days and looking to be riding Metra or perhaps even Amtrak, just stay abreast on their websites as to what is happening vis-a-vis services, because they will keep them up to date as much as possible. So moving on to other announcements, after more than 10 years at the RTA, I am sad, I guess, to announce that B. Raina Hickey has announced her retirement. She will be retiring November 1st. And B's leadership, I think, at the RTA has really been critical to many of our successes and pretty much all of our activities over the 10 years that she has been with us. And her leadership has been really critical for us. Her team, though, stands ready. She's built a great team around her and stands ready to support us and keep leading us through over the coming months as we look to fill the CFO spot here at RTA. So I would just like to formally, with the board, congratulate Bea on her long career and her 10 years here at the RTA. Wish her all the best in retirement, and hopefully she has fun and success. Where is she hiding? Back there. So thank you. So next slide, please. There we go. Brief legislative update. August 16, the FTA announced a $1.6 billion in grants across the country to about 150 agencies that operate bus and bus facilities as part of their low and what we call their low and no emission bus facilities program. The CTA was awarded $29 million in funding that's going to be used to buy electric buses and modernize their electrical and communication and safety systems associated with that as part of their efforts to transition to an all-electric fleet by 2040. So next slide, please. On September 26, we will open our call for projects, for community planning call for projects, I should say. That will open March 26, close on October 14. Once again, we will be jointly making this call for projects with CMAP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Our community planning work really focuses on a series of transportation and land use opportunities, really with the goal of advancing the key goals within our strategic plan, the current strategic plan, Invest in Transit, and really forward looking to what we know are the goals and the strategies that we look to attain or implement, I should say, in the coming strategic plan that we're working on right now. Really with a strong focus on strategic planning and development around walkable and sustainable communities in and near transit stations and along transit corridors. As much of our work in this area has been around transit-oriented development, corridor studies, curb management plans, and a variety of other implementation assistance as well. This year, equitable community engagement through providing compensation to residents and community groups for their participation in the planning process is a key thing that we're actually promoting and encouraging as part of this activity. We will also be focusing on what we're calling kind of transit neighborhood mobility improvement plan category, really with an emphasis on building strength and access around what we're calling mobility hubs, so key nodes around the area. Its project selection is expected to be completed by the end of this year, followed by public comment and a presentation to the board in early 23. And we'll keep information posted on our websites and updated in our various other publications, blogs, etc. I would encourage you, though, to spread the word amongst your networks and the groups that the area you serve in the region, so we can make sure we have good participation as people look to apply for these funds. So next slide. Just a quick overview of today's agenda, fairly straightforward. We're going to hear an update on the strategic plan, followed by a report on the monthly financials. And then there's several items that are going to require your action, including an ordinance authorizing an amendment to the 2022-26 capital program, and then the all-important ordinance establishing the funding marks for 23 through 25 for the regional operating budgets. And that really is kind of that key milestone in our annual budget process, and really gets the work going on wrapping up budget work for the coming year. And then we will also be asking for your vote on an amendment to our travel and business policy, expense policy, I should say. So that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Leanne. Any questions? Yes, Director Lewis.
Mr. Chairman, this is more of a comment than a question, but with the transportation strike being settled, I heard a lot of conversation with people, and I heard on the news last night where there was angst about how they would get downtown if in fact public transportation were curtailed. And I just wondered if maybe we might use this to piggyback on some of our marketing efforts to talk about the importance of public transportation, the necessity of public transportation, and the reason it needs to be supported, because I think that rail strike basically made a lot of people think about what am I going to do if I don't have public transportation to get me to and from. So I just thought it was timely and didn't know if we had plans to pivot off of that or not, but it's certainly something we should think about.
Thank you.
Great comment, Director Lewis. In fact, I'm not the freight railroads, but when you were reading about what the impact would be if the freight railroads actually shut down, from farmers to our commuters up here, rails are vital to this country's economic development and movement and security, as my father used to tell me. And if nothing else, I hope people pay attention to the importance of not only Metra, but also our freight rail system, who are great partners of ours in a public-private partnership that is huge. When people go, where are public-private partnerships? I always tell them Metra is probably one of the largest and oldest examples of a critical public-private partnership in the United States. So excellent comments. Any other comments other than B? We will salute you at the appropriate time, but you're the best budget director that I've ever seen or worked with. And we, Alex, where's Alex? Alex will have to pick up more of the role here with Director Melvin and others. But B, thank you so much for your service, and you'll have your day here before us. But thank you very, very much for everything you've done. You're the best. All right, moving on. After that sad note, 6B is a report on the monthly financial reports or results for July, and I think this is Doug Anderson. Or actually, we're supposed to do the strategic update, whatever, 6A, which is just Dr. Sue and Tina telling us how our update is on the strategic plan, focusing on the public engagement activities, which are large and underway.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chairman.
I was tearing up. I couldn't read my agenda after discussing
It's okay.
Dean's departure.
It's okay. We thought it was the chair's liberty there, changing the agenda. So good morning. Thank you for having me again with you. I'm here to provide a very short update on the strategic plan. I'm here with Tina Fassett-Smith today to talk a little bit about some of our engagement efforts. So on the next slide, recall that we are developing the plan over 3 tracks, and we still plan to have a draft plan to you this fall. Since we last spoke, we've essentially been going out and talking to people about the agenda for advocacy and action that we shared with you at the last meeting. So we'll just remind you a little bit about that. Recall on the next slide, recall that the agenda includes 14 items in 2 categories. All of the ideas really came from the working groups that we established to help us develop content. And on the next slide, remember that the advocacy list includes longer term items that really will change the way that transit operates in our region relative to the overall transportation system. This list includes changes that we really need our stakeholders to take the lead on. Fundamental to this is seeking new revenue for transit, but there are also 6 other items on the list. On the next slide, we have the action area list. This is really things that RTA and the service boards can take the lead on. Not that any of them are easy, but all of them are areas in which we think we could take small steps toward them, starting as soon as 2023. The list includes making the system more safe and secure and also adapting to the needs of riders. So on the next slide, since the last meeting, we've basically been taking this list out and talking to people about it. We've talked to many of you. We have been talking to the service board staff and their leadership. We've been setting up meetings with the county board chairs that'll be coming up soon and with their staff. We've been talking to or setting up meetings with elected officials, councils of governments, advocacy groups, really getting out and talking to lots of different people. The purpose of these meetings is just to bring people up to speed on where we are and make sure everyone has an opportunity to weigh in on this list early now. Beyond that, we've also been getting a lot of public input, so I'm going to hand it off to Tina now, who will tell you about some of the things that we're doing there. So, up to you, Tina.
Thanks, Jessica. So good morning. I'm Tina Smith, Director of Communications. Next slide, please. So on September 1st, we launched a public input survey. We've already received almost 500 responses, and the survey seeks to both educate and gauge support on the action and advocacy list, and importantly provides opportunity for those we can't engage with otherwise to let us know what might be missing from the list or what's most urgent for them. Next slide. We're also physically going out and doing in-person engagement across the region at events in every county. And these events are both to inform people about the challenges that are facing the transit system and to ask them to discuss their concerns and hopes for the future. Next slide. So as we engage with folks, we've been making note of who has really compelling stories or who feels really passionately about these topics so we can go back to them and get further testimonials, because we feel like it's important to put a face to the issue of what's at stake when we talk about transit's future, both in the strategic plan itself and in campaign materials that might come after. Next slide. So we're sharing both of these efforts, the survey and the opportunity to engage in person across our social media channels. We're asking our coalition partners to share them via social media toolkits and lots of outreach on the communications department's behalf. And we want to do this not only so we spread the word and get more responses to the survey, but so that we have an action we can ask our coalition members to do in support of our efforts. Next slide. So to recap, people can continue to engage with us through these in-person meetings that Jessica mentioned, through the online survey, through our writer engagement events across the region, and through this public meeting. The project team will be back with an update for you in October. We're going to share a summary of these engagement efforts and also a substantive update on the 2 technical working groups that are just wrapping up their work now. And of course, we have planned to have a draft strategic plan open for public comment in early December. And that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Any questions or comments? Thank you. I know you are reaching a lot of of our users or riders, and that's great. I know the CTA is doing a lot of outreach. I assume you're staying in touch with Brian Steele and the staff over there, and we can piggyback and vice versa on what their input is. But I know they have an extensive outreach that's really began publicly a week or 2 ago.
Yeah, we're sharing those via our newsletter and on social media, and are in contact with them as well.
Great, thank you. Excellent work. Very, very valuable too. All right, now we will move on to 6B and Doug Anderson for the monthly financial results. Hi, Doug.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Doug Anderson, Manager of Operating Budgets and Analysis. For information only, I'll be presenting the Service Board financial results through July, followed by our focus topic for this month, which is public funding sources for operations. Next slide, please. The Service Board's year-to-date operating deficit results continue to be significantly favorable to the amended budget adopted in May. Each Service Board's operating expenses were under budget, and with the exception of ADA paratransit, operating revenue was above budget for each, resulting in the favorable operating deficit variances shown here. Next slide, please. Our other routine update is the status of federal relief funding. The service boards have drawn another $14 million since our update last month, and as a region, we have now utilized 41.9% of the $3.5 billion total. Relief funding is still expected to last well into the 2025 budget year. Next slide, please. Last month, B presented information on the RTA sales tax and how well it has been performing. To wrap up that topic, I will cover one final aspect of sales tax, and that is seasonality. Over the course of the year, our sales tax receipts do vary significantly by month, driven by consumer spending patterns. With no seasonality, one would expect each of the 12-month shares of the annual total to be 8.3%. As shown on the chart, January and February are the weakest months of the year at around 7% share, while December on the far right side has always been the strongest month with an almost 10% share due to holiday shopping. All of the summer months are relatively strong, June in particular. This seasonality pattern comes into play when we forecast sales tax receipts and service board funding by month in some of our detailed cash flow schedules. Next slide, please. In addition to RTA sales tax, a significant amount of support for the operating budget comes from the state of Illinois. This is primarily in the form of public transportation fund payments, or PTF, which is the 30% state match of sales tax and RET receipts you hear us refer to frequently. PTF 1 dates back to the original RTA Act and provides a 25% match of sales tax 1, while PTF 2, a state match of sales tax 1, sales tax 2, and the real estate transfer tax, was added with the 2008 funding reform. As you might expect, PTF experiences a seasonality similar to that of the RTA sales tax. In addition to PTF, the state provides funding which partially reimburses the service boards for mandated reduced fare programs. This funding had traditionally been provided in the amount of $34 million per year, but was cut in half to $17.6 million about 7 years ago. Since 2010, the state has also provided more than $8 million of annual funding to support PACE's ADA paratransit operations. Finally, the state provides annual support which covers the RTA's debt service on Strategic Capital Improvement Program, or SCIP, bonds, which were issued in the 1990s and early 2000s. You will see this referred to as ASA and AFA, which stands for Additional State Assistance and Additional Financial Assistance. Since some of the earlier bonds are beginning to mature, budgeted ASA-AFA amounts will begin to decline before ending around 2035 when the last of the SCIP bonds is retired. In total, these components of state support for our 2022 operating budget exceed $600 million. While RTA sales tax receipts are in a 3-month lag and never late, all state funding for operations is subject to delays reflecting the state's fiscal condition and/or execution of grant agreements. Over the last 2 years, the RTA has experienced such a remarkable improvement in state funding delays that the RTA is operating without short-term debt for the first time in over a decade. Next slide, please. To round out the remaining sources of operating funding support, we have the real estate transfer tax, or RET, and federal funding for operations. The RET is generated from both residential and commercial property transactions within the city of Chicago. It provides about $75 million of operating funding directly to CTA. And finally, federal grants are made available to the RTA for community programs and to PACE for funding of certain programs such as van pool. Next slide, please. To summarize, the vast majority of our $2.2 billion of public funding for operations comes from local and state sources. While the region does receive around $800 million per year from the FTA for capital funding, ongoing federal support for operations is currently minimal. The very notable exception, of course, is the $3.5 billion of COVID relief funding provided by the federal government in 2020 and 2021. That funding was and continues to be critically important, but is not reflected in this chart due to its temporary nature. Our goal here was to show more of a steady state view. Next slide, please. In closing, we are making good progress on our focus areas, and we can now check public funding off the list. More topics are coming at future board meetings, including funding allocation formulas and the criteria budgets must meet for adoption. That concludes my presentation. Back to you, Mr. Chairman, for any questions the board may have.
Thanks, Doug. Any questions or comments? All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to 7A, which are the ordinances authorizing amendment to the 2022 to 2026 capital program and time extensions and funding reallocations for ICE-funded projects. Tara, good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I'm Tara O'Malley, Principal Financial Analyst in our Capital Program Department. Today, we are requesting your approval of the amendment to the 2022 to 2026 capital program and time extensions and budget changes to some ICE-funded projects. Next slide, please. The funding for the 2022 to 2026 capital program includes changes to the approved funding and projects for CTA and PACE. The overall program is increasing by $85.42 million. CTA's program is increasing by $83.67 million, and PACE's is increasing by $1.75 million. There are no changes to Metro's capital program included in this amendment. Details of all revenue and project changes can be found in the memo and Schedules 2A and 2B in your board packet. Today, we will highlight some of the project changes occurring in this amendment. Next slide, please. First, let's discuss the Red Purple Modernization Project with CTA. We are happy to report that $265.5 million of FTA core capacity funds have been appropriated in the federal fiscal year of 2022 to CTA for the Red Purple Modernization, or RPM, Phase 1 of the project. This results in 2023 and 2024 RPM funding allocations being advanced into 2022 and ensures that federal funding will be available to complete this phase of the project. Once the funds are granted, CTA will have received the full federal allocation of funds for Phase 1 of the project, totaling $956.6 million. Next slide, please. The next project we'll highlight is CTA's Red Line Extension. Recent estimates show an overall project budget increase from $2.4 billion to $3.6 billion. CTA is currently in the design and engineering phase. With this action, CTA is adding $40 million in 2023 CTA bond funds to help complete the current phase. CTA plans to program future funds for construction. Next slide, please. For our last CTA highlight, I want to look at the new CTA Control and Training Center. CTA had planned to fund this project with CTA bonds and has found an opportunity to reprogram Rebuild Illinois bonds. Changing the funding to Rebuild Illinois bonds will reduce CTA's need to issue new bonds and save financing costs to the region. $32.2 million will be reprogrammed to the Control and Training Center with this amendment. Next slide, please. PACE's proposed amendment reprograms $1.75 million in RTA bonds to purchase electric buses under 2 pilot programs. Next slide, please. We're turning to the ICE amendments with this action authorizing 12-month extensions to 6 Metro ICE projects and 2 ICE projects for PACE. It also authorizes changes to certain project budgets. Details can be found in the board memo. Next slide, please. RTA staff has reviewed these requests and found them to be justified as outlined in the ordinance request memo. Staff requests adoption of the following ordinances: approval of the amendment to the 2022 to 2026 capital program and the approval of time extensions and budget changes to the ICE program. I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we are seeking your approval for these two ordinances.
Thank you, Tara. Any comments or questions? If there are none, yes, Liz. Director Gorman.
Thank you, Tara, for that. Now in the board packet, it's for the cost of the buses, there's four, for CTA and two for, PACE that were highlighted up there. I'm just curious about the individual costs, you know, the buses they hear. Do you have any of that information, or is that something we can get later?
We can absolutely provide that to you.
All right.
I don't know it off the top
No,
of
I'm
my
sure you
head.
don't. Right. All right, thank
So,
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? If not, how about a motion in a second so we can approve both of those? Director Carey moves, seconded by Director Holt, that we approve these two ordinances. I guess now, can we do leave for the attendance roll call? If there's no objection, is there leave for the attendance roll call on these two? Leave is granted and they are adopted. It's nice to be back in person. Good morning, Victor. How are you? Items, let's see. Next is after Tara's report is 7B, which is a very important ordinance adopting and establishing the funding amounts available to the service boards for 2023 to 2025 operating budgets.
Excuse me, Chairman.
Yeah,
With respect, we need to vote on that last motion.
I'm sorry, what's that? Director?
7A, do we not?
I thought we adopted Tara's. Jeremy, didn't we adopt 7A?
7A you adopted, correct?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Okay.
We just did the attendance roll call, Dr. Sauger. And would you please add, Mr. Secretary, add Director Gathing to the roll call?
And Director Melvin as well, Mr. Chairman.
And Director Melvin, we're Director Melvin.
Good morning.
Excellent. I love it to hear your voice, Director Melvin. All right, let's go on to 7B. As I was saying, these are the service board marks for 2023 to 2025, the required recovery ratios also for 23, and the preliminary 2023 to 2027 capital program funding amounts. I believe the service boards are signed off, and for the newer members, this is yeoman's work once again by and I thank the service boards for their cooperation, but not only members of the board, but most importantly, our staff to get these marks signed off on is never easy. And I deeply appreciate all of the time that you've put in to work on these. So with that, Bill Lackman and Brian Lowenberg, please brief the board.
RTA board members. As Chairman Dillard said, this is Bill Lackman, RTA Treasurer and Budget Manager. Over the past couple of months, RTA staff has met with the CTA, METRA, and PACE finance teams to refine the proposed operating funding and capital amounts you are considering today. And my thanks go out to the service board CFOs and budget directors for their candid input and cooperation. I will be giving you the details of the operating funding allocations for 2023, followed by Brian Lowenberg, who will present the capital funding picture. Next slide, please. The proposed ordinance would adopt the operating and capital funding amounts, or marks, for the 2023 budget and 5-year capital program. Setting the marks is a critical step in the RTA region's annual budget process. The RTA Act establishes September 15th as the date by which funding amounts for the upcoming year must be adopted. And the Act further requires that the service boards develop budgets that are consistent with the approved funding amounts. The approved marks will be supplemented as necessary by federal COVID relief, comprised of existing CARES Act, CRISA, and ARP Act funding. Next slide, please. After declining by 8.2% in 2020 due to the COVID-19 impacts, sales tax rebounded sharply in 2021 as the effects of the pandemic eased and local sales taxes were extended to more online purchases. Sales tax finished 2021 at almost $1.5 billion, more than $200 million higher than pre-pandemic levels. After discussions with the Service Board finance teams, the RTA has utilized the sales tax growth rates shown on the chart to determine the Service Board funding levels. Under these assumptions, RTA sales tax receipts are expected to surpass the $1.5 billion level this year and reach almost $1.7 billion by 2025. Next slide, please. The recently approved state fiscal year 2023 budget provided for PTF to be funded at the full, uncut 30% state match of sales tax and real estate transfer tax. Total PTF is now expected to exceed $495 million for 2023 and reach $532 million by 2025. The state budget maintained the $8.4 billion level of ADA paratransit funding and $130 million level of state assistance for RTA skip bond debt service. Next slide, please. This table shows the resulting amounts of RTA operating funding proposed for each service board in bold. Compared to the amended 2022 budget adopted in May. Due to the continued growth in RTA sales tax, the proposed service board funding amounts are up by 3.9% to 4.2% from the current budget. The detail behind these operating funding levels is included in Schedule 1A of the proposed ordinance. The proposed funding amounts incorporate PACE's best estimate of the 2023 through 2025 ADA paratransit funding requirements. Due to the ongoing recovery, there remains considerable uncertainty with projected ADA paratransit ridership and expense levels. If additional funding becomes necessary for ADA paratransit during the 2023 budget year, the RTA will work with PACE staff to propose a funding amount which may be comprised of previously allocated CRISA funding, use of ADA paratransit reserve funds, or if necessary, an additional sales tax allocation. Overall, funding for the RTA agency's combined requirements is down by $0.6 million from the 2022 budget due to reduced debt service expense. Next slide, please. The proposed ordinance also sets the required service board recovery ratios for the upcoming year, largely unchanged from the 2022 requirements. The ADA paratransit recovery ratio, which was not reduced in 2022, is proposed to be lowered to 7.5%, consistent with the April recovery ratio reductions for the mainline service boards. PACE staff has indicated that PACE's proposed 2023 ADA paratransit budget will not be able to meet the traditional 10% recovery ratio requirement due to the lapsing of single ride expense credits, necessitating this lower recovery ratio requirement. Each of these reduced requirements is enabled by state statute, which provided recovery ratio relief through the 2023 budget year. Although federal relief funding remains authorized to be included in the calculation of recovery ratios, additional temporary or permanent legislative relief from the 50% regional recovery ratio requirement must remain an urgent priority for the RTA and the service boards due to the reduced ridership and fare revenue resulting from the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Next, I will highlight 3 non-routine items included within the proposed ordinance. In a process change, the distribution of ICE funding will be paused for 2 years beginning in 2023. This will allow actual ICE amounts to be determined prior to the execution of ICE grant agreements for approved operating or capital projects, eliminating the administrative burden of managing variances of actual ICE funding from budgeted amounts. ICE funding shares will remain unchanged at 48%, 39%, and 13% for CTA, METRA, and PACE respectively. And of course, the RTA board will continue to approve ICE projects. Also new in 2023, RTA staff proposes to rescind a policy which required service board positive budget variances from operations to be used primarily for capital investment, with some exclusions. The PBV for capital policy, as we call it, has become less desirable in the current operating revenue and relief funding environment. Rescission will provide the service boards with increased flexibility to program prior year PBV amounts in future operating budgets. Finally, the ordinance recommends that existing ARP Act funding allocations be maintained. In November 2021, RTA Ordinance 2021-60 established the American Rescue Plan Act allocations to the service boards. The ordinance required the RTA to re-examine the ARP Act funding allocations among the service boards prior to the adoption of the 2023 to 2025 operating funding amounts. After reviewing the most recent service board revenue and expense projections contained in the 2022 budget amendment adopted in May, staff recommends that the ARP Act funding allocations remain as allocated in November 2021. Now, I'll turn the presentation over to Brian Lowenberg, Manager of Capital Programs, for discussion of the capital funding amounts. Next slide.
Thanks, Bill. Focusing first on the 2023 capital program, there are $1.37 billion available for capital projects. The federal amount is based on funds made available from the federally approved Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, signed into law November 15, 2021. The bill provides an average increase of 40% per year for federal formula funds. Federal funds also include discretionary opportunities that the service boards are planning to pursue. Some of the opportunities include the All Stations Accessibility Program, the Low and No Emission Bus Facilities Program that Leanne mentioned, and the Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity programs. The state funding reflects the region's PAYGO funds from the state motor fuel tax, along with 2 additional funding sources: residual Jumpstart bond funds and funds from the Illinois Department of Consumer and Economic Opportunity. RTA funding is made up of a $130 million bond issuance planned for 2023. There are no planned ICE funds included in the 2023 capital budget, as noted earlier in the presentation by Bill. Service board and local funding is primarily made up of a $171 million CTA bond issuance, as well as $5 million in Cook County funds. Next slide, please. This chart shows how capital funding from all sources is split amongst the service boards for next year. CTA has approximately 58% of capital funds, Metra about 37% of available dollars, and PACE just over 5% of the funding in 2023. Next slide, please. Now, let's review the funding over the 5-year time horizon by funding source. The 2023 to 2027 capital program has an estimated total of $5.72 billion. Federal funding represents 72% of available funds. State funding is 20% of the program. Service Board and local funds account for 6% of the program, and RTA funds are 2% of the available total. Next slide, please. This chart shows how capital funding from all sources is split amongst the service boards over the 5-year period. Over the 5-year period, CTA has a 60% share at $3.46 billion, Metra a 33% split at $1.89 billion, and PACE has 7% of funds at $382 million. Next slide, please. Before concluding, I wanted to remind the board about the performance-based capital allocation process. The new allocation method was approved at our July 2021 board meeting and is used to allocate PAYGO funds and federal formula funds beginning with the 2025 allocations. Funding in 2023 and 2024 is based on historic allocation methods. Our collective goal in implementing performance-based allocations is to use a data-driven approach to allocate funds based on 3 key principles. The first principle discussed on this slide is to address capital reinvestment need. To that end, we use the 20-year state of good repair metric to determine the baseline allocation of funds. This measure estimates the amount of funding each service board would need to reach a state of good repair of all assets within 20 years. The proportion of this need makes up the initial funding split. The 20-year state of good repair need is determined by the Strategic Asset Management Working Group, which includes both Service Board and RTA staff. The group is tasked with regularly updating the needs assessment with new data to reflect investments that are being made. In 2022, the need-based allocation, which applies to 2027, was updated, and there was a slightly different allocation that impacted Metra and PACE. Both the original allocation percentages, which apply to 2025 and 2026 funds, and the updated 2027 allocation percentages are presented on this slide. The document, Update to 20-Year Needs Assessment, details these changes and is included in the board packet. Next slide, please. The second principle is to incentivize faster completion of projects. 50% of funds are allocated based on the 20-year state of good repair needs percentages, and then are incremented based on 2 measures. Average age of funds, which has a goal to be under 2.5 years old, and percent of funds spent with a goal of spending at least 20% of available funds annually. Both metrics are built on 3-year averages. Service boards that meet the performance measures have no change to their available funding. If a measure is not met, funds are incrementally set aside for future reallocation. For 2027, as shown on the slide, and based on the performance criteria discussed, either $3.4 million or $5.5 million would have been withheld from this 5-year program, primarily due to slower spend rates for all service boards. If CTA debt service payments are not included in the percent of funds spent, CTA will have a withholding of approximately $2.1 million in 2027. If debt service payments are included, then CTA would not have a withholding for 2027. Metra has a withholding of $2.1 million and PACE a withholding of $1.3 million for the 2027 budget. Since an allocation methodology has yet to be established for withheld or set aside funds, RTA staff is recommending that 2027 withholding funds not be set aside at this time, and instead programmed by the respective service boards, similar to the calculated set-asides for 2025 and 2026. Discussions for determining how to redistribute these withheld funds will continue following the adoption of the 2023 Regional Strategic Plan. Detailed calculations of these measures can be found in the board memo. Next slide. The final prong of the performance-based capital allocation is that a minimum 20% of the value of projects must meet one of the regional policy priorities, achieving full accessibility, or improving equity, as identified in the current strategic plan, Invest in Transit. The service boards will submit these projects as part of their capital program submittals and will be presented to the board as part of the regional budget. Now let me turn it back to Bill to close out the presentation.
Next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Finally, here's a snapshot of the 2023 budget calendar. The RTA board adopted the budget call in May, setting up the budget development schedule. Today, we are recommending board adoption of the funding allocations as Brian and I have presented. On October 7th, the service boards will submit their proposed draft capital project details. On October 14th, just 4 weeks from Friday, or tomorrow, the service boards submit their proposed operating budgets, 2-year financial plans, and 5-year capital programs to the RTA before entering the public hearing process in October and November. On November 15th, is the statutorily defined date for the service boards to submit their adopted budgets to the RTA. On November 17th, the RTA board will feature presentations of the budgets and capital programs of each agency. On December 15th, staff will present the consolidated regional budget and program for board adoption. This concludes our presentation. Brian and I are requesting board adoption of the funding amounts as presented. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Bill and Brian. Questions or comments? Yes, Director Colson.
Maybe you can clarify something for me. Of these 2023 proposed operating funding amounts, how much of that is ARP or CARES money? Maybe I'm missing something from this.
So this is all funding amounts from the RTA.
Okay.
And the service boards will supplement with the federal relief funding
Okay.
for their budget.
Okay, so it's not part of this calculation?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Director Lewis.
Bill, I know we've talked about the recovery ratio before, but if I understood correctly, while we know that the budgets as presented will not meet the recovery ratio, we're counting on the fact that the pass that we have through 23 is going to be the time at which we'll have to really address that issue fully. Is that my understanding?
Right. We have recovery ratio relief through 2023. So afterwards, we'll need to address the recovery ratio relief for the future.
Okay, thank you.
Director Carey.
On the withholding, capital withholding, I understand staff's going to go back after adoption of the strategic plan and talk about the allocation method, which is great, and come back to the board with a recommendation. I would suggest that the decision on whether or not to look at CTA with debt payments or without debt payments be part of that process. So that's a big difference in the way we look at it, or could look at it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Anyone else in person? Jeremy, you see any hands raised virtually? No, all right. Dr. Sagar.
I would appreciate if you would go back, because we're not only proving the funding levels that have been proposed, but we're also looking at these changes to process. And so I want to just ask a little bit more detail, please, for the change with regards to the PBV. If you can explain to me why that is undesirable. I mean, we've been told that it's not desirable any longer. What's the reason it's undesirable?
Right. So a couple of reasons. Number one is we want to manage or extend the use of our relief funding. So if the service board has a positive budget variance in 1 year, if they can use it for operations in the following year, that will help preserve the federal relief funding going forward. We also, we are no longer funding at budget, right? We're funding at actual. And we have asked the service boards to have reserves in case of downtimes. So this will also allow the service boards to use any positive budget variance to put in reserves for the future.
Thank you. So, I mean, that sounds very, very practical and very logical. So I just want to make sure that I understand the current policy then, as it were, with PVBV would actually not allow those things at all to take place?
But
There's no flexibility there.
the current policy requires that the service boards use positive budget variance either for capital or for one-time operating
Okay.
projects.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
If I may add, Director Sager, this is a policy that's been in place for many years, but it was also at a time when there wasn't much capital funding. And we think it's so important. It was a request from the service boards, but we think it's so important that they maintain the greatest flexibility in the use of positive budget variance, because they're going to need it. You see what's happening, as you learn more about the strategic plan, you know that there's a big shortfall coming. So for all the reasons that Bill stated, we no longer fund to budget as we did. But in the past, we were really scrambling for capital money. We still need capital money. There's certainly a lot of unmet need, but we think it's so important to maintain flexibility in these funds for operating, because right now, they're going to need money for operating. So that is why, and it doesn't mean it's forever waived. It might be something that the board might want to reconsider in a few years, but right now we think that it's very important that they be able to use that with as much flexibility as possible.
I concur with that, and I thank you very much for the explanation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, B. That does make sense. Any other questions or comments? I thank you. We're coming off COVID recovery, and now we have inflation as a new factor that we've not had in previous years, at least recently. So not an easy task to do this. All right, this one we must take a roll call on. So can I have a motion and a second to approve? Director Lewis moves that we approve, seconded by Director Holt. And with that, Mr. Secretary, please take a roll call.
Director Indalcio.
Aye.
Director Canty.
Aye.
Director Carey.
Aye.
Director Colson. Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Gavin.
Aye.
Director Gorman.
Aye.
Director Groven.
Aye.
Director Holt.
Aye.
Director Cotel.
Aye.
Director Lewis.
Aye.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Pang.
Yes.
Director Ross.
Yes.
Director Sager.
Yes.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes,
16 ayes, Mr. Chairman.
thank you. And it is, item 7B is approved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
7C and 7D, I think we can address these next two travel and expense related agenda items at the same time as they appear on the board agenda. The first one, item 7C, is is an ordinance amending the travel and business expense policy. We certainly can take questions on that, but with inflation having just been mentioned, and that is one of the primary reasons for the change is. And item 7D is the approval of travel reimbursement expenses as they've been presented in your board packet. Any questions on these? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion in a second. Director Cotel moves, seconded by Director Andalcio. And with that, Jeremy, I think we can probably do leave for the attendance roll call on items 7C and 7D. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And we'll do the attendance roll call on that one, Jeremy, as it sounds like it is unanimous. And those are approved. Thank you very much. Item 8 is new business, and I know Director Fuentes wants to bring up something in new business.
Yes, thank you. As a board, we always discuss accessibility, especially with people with disabilities. And I attended the ADA coordination meeting in August, and I just wanted to give the board an update. I thought it was a very interesting meeting. Given COVID and everything, it was, the service boards are definitely trying to improve accessibility, which is always good to see. But even from the largest details of elevator and elevator maintenance to getting new stair steps for people with visual disabilities and wider step. I mean, so they're really looking into what is the best possible way we can help people with disabilities as we move through the process of giving them an opportunity to go to work. So I just wanted to commend Michael and Leanne was on the meeting also with the service boards, their diligence to look at what is the latest in technology as we improve, because as we know with budgets, you know, once you build a station or, you know, even when you change a stairwell, it's going to be a while before you do the next. So they're really doing an effort to make sure that they're getting the best qualified equipment and products available moving forward. So I just wanted to add that to the minutes because I thought Michael and his team did an excellent job, and the service boards. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great comment. And I know that President Carter at the CTA constantly, Phil talks about ADA accessibility as part of their long-term plan, and Director Dewinski, who I saw just the other day, about ADA compliance on a particular station. Both CTA and Metra, and I'm sure PACES as well, are keenly aware and actually champions for better ADA compliance and accessibility, and are building the changes we need to do into their long-term capital plans, which is great. And there's no better advocate than Director Fuentes for ADA compliance, along with Senator Duckworth, who nationally has become a leader in ADA compliance, and we appreciate her leadership in that role. Any other new business to come before us for discussion purposes only? If not, it's kind of nice to have a regular meeting of the RTA. Again, kudos to everybody on the marks and having all the service boards sign off early to allow us to get out of here at 10 after 10 today. So I deeply appreciate that. With that, our next meeting will be on October 20th of 22. It's hard to believe we're almost into Halloween. But if there's no further business to come before the
Chairman, I think
yes.
Director Pang has a raised hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Director Pang. Hi, Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about B. So I have known B since the Daley administration, early in the early 90s. I did math on that probably for B, so forgive me. I just wanted to say that I know the directors know this, but B, you are a super skilled, total professional. You are very strategic with the finances, which is the underpinning of everything we do. You are an excellent communicator. You are so clear and use so few words to take us through the financials that oftentimes there's not a lot of questions about it. There's never really questions about the finances, but why. You get right to the why. And I also want to say that you are tough and strong and also kind, which doesn't always come together with people, but it does with you. And I think of you as a diplomat for what you've done within the RTA and with the service boards, CTA, Metra, and PACE. You are really good at listening, but you're really strong too. And Doug and Bill presented today, which is two of a really skilled finance team. And it's clear that you are a great leader. I'll miss you. Except for we can have lunch after the October month. We'll do that.
She says, thank you very much, Director Pang, and so well said. And we will be and embarrass her at a future meeting. But B, you make Leanne and myself and all the board sleep easier at night, knowing that you're at the helm. And I appreciate that you are one tough woman, but also, as Sarah said, a great communicator and somebody that is, just does yeoman's work. So thank you. Anything else to come before us? If not, how about a motion and a second to adjourn? Director Lewis moves that we adjourned, seconded by Director Colson. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. And we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.